The winter of 1781 in Sheffield, Massachusetts brought more than just snow to the Ashley household. It brought the beginning of something that would haunt the Berkshire Mountains for decades to come. What you're about to hear isn't the Elizabeth Freeman story they teach in history books. This is the version they buried, the one discovered in a locked chest beneath the floorboards of the old courthouse during its demolition in 1972, written in the shaking hand of Judge Theodore Sedgwick himself, who begged that these pages never see daylight. But some stories refuse to stay buried, and Elizabeth Freeman's true story is one that demands to be told. Before we dive into the nightmare that unfolded in the Ashley mansion, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. These are the stories they don't want you to know, the dark truths hiding beneath America's polished history. And tell me in the comments, what state are you watching from? I love hearing from viewers across the country who are ready to learn the real stories behind our nation's past. Elizabeth Freeman, known to the Ashley family as Bet, stood in the kitchen of the Grand Colonial Mansion on that December morning, her hand steady despite the rage burning in her chest. At 40 years old, she had spent her entire life as property of the Ashley family, first belonging to John Ashley's father, then inherited like furniture when the old man died. But something had changed in Elizabeth that winter, something that went beyond the usual quiet resistance of an enslaved woman who had learned to survive through patience and cunning. The change had started 3 weeks earlier, when Hannah Ashley, the Colonel's wife, had taken a heated shovel from the fireplace and swung it at Elizabeth's younger sister Lizzie. Elizabeth had thrown herself between them, taking the blow on her own arm, the metal searing through fabric and flesh, leaving a scar that would mark her for the rest of her days. But it wasn't the pain that changed everything. It was what happened when the blood hit the floor. The moment Elizabeth's blood touched the wooden planks of the Ashley house, she heard them. Voices, countless voices, whispering in languages she didn't recognize but somehow understood. They were the voices of every person who had died in bondage within those walls, stretching back generations, and they were offering her something she had never imagined possible. Not just freedom, but power. The kind of power that could make the Ashley family pay for every cruelty they had inflicted. Colonel John Ashley was considered one of the most respectable men in Berkshire County. A lawyer, a judge, a man who had helped draft the Sheffield Declaration, asserting that mankind in a state of nature are equal, free, and independent of each other. The irony of those words wasn't lost on Elizabeth as she served his meals, washed his clothes, and listened to him discuss liberty and justice with his wealthy friends while she remained his property. Ashley owned at least 5 enslaved people, including Elizabeth, her sister Lizzie, a man named Zach, and 2 children whose names were never recorded in any document, because Ashley didn't consider them worth remembering. The mansion itself seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy that only Elizabeth could feel after that night with the shovel. Built in 1735, its walls had witnessed 46 years of bondage, cruelty, and death. Elizabeth discovered she could sense the memories trapped within those walls, feel the terror of a young girl who had frozen to death in the unheated slave quarters during the winter of 1763. Taste the desperation of a mother who had watched her infant son sold away in 1771, experience the final moments of an elderly man who had been worked to death and buried in an unmarked grave behind the property. These spirits didn't just speak to Elizabeth, they showed her things. Secret documents hidden in Ashley's study that revealed the true extent of his involvement in the slave trade, despite his public proclamations about equality. Letters discussing the breeding of enslaved people like livestock, calculating the profit margins of selling children, detailed records of punishments that would make even hardened criminals shudder. But most importantly, they showed her the law books in Ashley's library and whispered the knowledge she would need to use his own legal system against him. Elizabeth began her education in secret, slipping into the study after the family had retired for the night. The spirits guided her to specific passages, illuminating the text with an otherworldly glow that allowed her to read in complete darkness. She learned about habeas corpus, about the contradictions in Massachusetts law, about the recent case of Quock Walker that had created a legal precedent she could exploit. But the spirits demanded payment for their assistance. Each night of learning cost her something, aging her in ways that weren't visible on the surface, but that she could feel in her bones. The first sign that something unnatural was happening came when Hannah Ashley began experiencing nightmares. She would wake screaming about invisible hands choking her, about faces in the walls watching her, about voices accusing her of crimes she swore she hadn't committed. Colonel Ashley dismissed these as feminine hysteria, but Elizabeth knew better. The spirits were growing impatient. They wanted justice, and they were willing to torment the living to get it. As winter deepened, strange occurrences plagued the Ashley household. Milk would curdle moments after being brought from the cow. Fires would extinguish themselves in the middle of the night, leaving the family to wake in freezing darkness. Objects would move on their own, particularly the instruments of punishment, the whips and shackles Ashley kept in the barn appearing in his bed, at his dinner table, in his church pew for all the congregation to see. Elizabeth watched all of this with a calm that unnerved even the other enslaved people in the household. Lizzie begged her sister to stop whatever she was doing, sensing that Elizabeth was somehow connected to these supernatural events. But Elizabeth had made a pact with forces that demanded completion. 3 lawsuits, the spirits had told her. 3 times she would face the Massachusetts courts, and 3 times she would win. But each victory would cost the Ashley family more than just her freedom. The preparation for her first lawsuit began on a night when the moon was dark and the wind howled through the Berkshire Mountains like the screams of the damned. Elizabeth stood in the centre of the kitchen, surrounded by 13 candles she had made from tallow mixed with her own blood. The spirits had taught her this ritual, one that would bind the truth to her words and make it impossible for any judge to ignore her claims. As she spoke the words they had given her, words in a language that predated European colonization of these lands, the temperature in the room dropped so dramatically that frost formed on the windows despite the roaring fire. Shadows gathered in the corners, taking shapes that resembled human figures, but moved in ways that defied natural law. These shadow beings whispered promises of vengeance, of a justice that went beyond mere legal freedom. The next morning, Elizabeth walked 7 miles through knee-deep snow to the home of Theodore Sedgwick, a lawyer who had been vocal about his opposition to slavery. She arrived at his door just as dawn was breaking, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air, but her dark skin showing no signs of the cold that should have left her hypothermic. Sedgwick would later write in his private journal that when he opened his door that morning, he felt as though he was looking not at a woman seeking legal help, but at something ancient and terrible that had chosen to wear human form. "I want to sue for my freedom," Elizabeth told him, her voice carrying an authority that made this prominent white lawyer step back involuntarily. "And you're going to help me, Mr. Sedgwick, because if you don't, the things that will happen to this county will make the revolution look like a gentle disagreement between friends." Sedgwick, despite his progressive views on slavery, was not a man easily intimidated. But something in Elizabeth's eyes, a darkness that seemed to swirl like smoke behind her pupils, convinced him that her threat was not idle. He agreed to take her case, though he would later confess to his wife that he felt as though he had made a deal with something far more dangerous than a desperate enslaved woman. The news of Elizabeth's lawsuit spread through Sheffield like wildfire. An enslaved woman suing for her freedom based on the state's constitution was unprecedented, and the Ashley family's response was swift and vicious. Colonel Ashley used his influence to turn the community against Elizabeth, spreading rumours that she had poisoned his wife, that she practiced witchcraft, that she had made a pact with the devil himself. The irony was that Ashley was closer to the truth than he realised, though the entities Elizabeth had allied herself with were older and stranger than any Christian devil. These were the spirits of the land itself, forces that had been worshipped and feared by indigenous peoples for thousands of years before European colonization, entities that had been feeding on the suffering caused by slavery and were now ready to collect their due. As the date of the first trial approached, the supernatural activity in Sheffield intensified. Animals began behaving strangely, with normally docile cows attacking their handlers and horses refusing to pass by the Ashley mansion. Children reported seeing a tall, dark woman walking through walls, leaving burning footprints in her wake. The minister claimed his Bible had burst into flames during a sermon about the righteousness of slavery, the pages turning to ash except for one passage about the liberation of the Israelites from Egypt. Elizabeth, meanwhile, continued her work in the Ashley household as if nothing had changed, though everyone who interacted with her noticed a transformation. Her eyes seemed to see through people, into their deepest secrets and fears. When she served dinner, family members found themselves confessing sins they had never spoken aloud. When she passed by, mirrors would crack, and her reflection would show not one woman but dozens, all bearing the scars of slavery, all staring with accusatory eyes. The first trial began on a morning when the sky over Sheffield turned the colour of old blood, though no one could explain the meteorological phenomenon. The courthouse was packed with spectators, both black and white, all sensing that something momentous was about to occur. Colonel Ashley had hired the best lawyers money could buy, men who argued that the Constitution's words about equality clearly didn't apply to Africans, who they claimed were a different species altogether, incapable of true reasoning or moral judgment. Elizabeth sat quietly through these arguments, her hands folded in her lap, but those sitting near her would later swear they heard whispering, dozens of voices speaking in unison just below the threshold of normal hearing. When it came time for her to testify, she stood slowly and the temperature in the courthouse dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Frost spread across the windows and several people claimed they saw their breath-forming shapes that looked like screaming faces. "I was born free," Elizabeth began, her voice carrying to every corner of the room despite speaking barely above a whisper. "Every human being is born free. It is only the cruelty and greed of others that puts us in chains. But chains can be broken, and those who forge them will learn that every link they create becomes a weight upon their own souls." As she spoke, strange things began happening in the courthouse. The portrait of George Washington that hung behind the judge's bench began to bleed from the eyes. Documents on the lawyers' tables burst into flames, only to reform moments later. Most disturbing of all, several prominent slave owners in attendance began to choke, gasping for air as invisible hands seemed to tighten around their throats. Judge William Cushing, presiding over the case, was a rational man who didn't believe in the supernatural. But as Elizabeth testified about the beatings, the humiliations, the sale of children, and the systematic dehumanization she had endured, he found himself seeing visions. In his mind's eye, he witnessed every cruelty she described as if he were experiencing it himself. He felt the bite of the whip, the weight of the chains, the despair of watching loved ones sold away. Later, he would tell his wife that it was as if Elizabeth had the power to make others truly understand suffering in a way that mere words never could. The jury deliberated for less than an hour, though several jurors would later claim that the time in the deliberation room felt like days. They reported hearing voices, seeing shadows move independently of their sources, and feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched by countless eyes. When they returned with their verdict that Elizabeth should be free, based on the Massachusetts Constitution's declaration that all men are born free and equal, the spirit's whispers rose to a roar that only Elizabeth could hear. But Colonel Ashley wasn't finished. He immediately filed an appeal, claiming that the jury had been influenced by witchcraft, that Elizabeth had used supernatural means to corrupt the legal process. This accusation, while dismissed by the appeals court, contained more truth than Ashley probably realized. The spirits had indeed influenced the proceedings, but not through Elizabeth's conscious direction. They had simply made it impossible for anyone in that courthouse to ignore the truth of slavery's evil. The second trial took place 3 months later, and by then the Ashley household had become a place of constant terror. Servants reported that the walls bled at night, that voices called their names from empty rooms, that the faces in family portraits changed expressions when no one was looking. Hannah Ashley had stopped sleeping entirely, claiming that whenever she closed her eyes she saw the faces of every enslaved person who had died on their property, all of them reaching out to drag her down into darkness. Elizabeth continued to work in the house during this period, seemingly immune to the supernatural chaos around her. But those who looked closely could see the toll her alliance with the spirits was taking. Her hair, once black as midnight, now showed streaks of white. Her hands, previously steady and strong, would sometimes become translucent, as if she were fading from this world. She ate little and slept less, spending her nights in whispered conversation with beings only she could see. The second trial was held in Great Barrington, a change of venue that Ashley had requested, believing that distance from Sheffield would lessen Elizabeth's supposed supernatural influence. He was wrong. If anything, the manifestations were more powerful, more visceral. During Ashley's lawyer's opening statement arguing that property rights were sacred and inviolable, every window in the courthouse shattered simultaneously, showering the room with glass that somehow managed to avoid cutting anyone, instead forming patterns on the floor that spelled out names, hundreds of names of enslaved people who had died in Berkshire County. This time, Elizabeth didn't testify verbally. Instead, when called to the stand, she simply stood and removed the sleeve of her dress, revealing the scar from Hannah Ashley's attack with the hot shovel. But what the court saw wasn't just a scar. The wound seemed to open before their eyes, and from it poured not blood but visions, projected into the air like some impossible magic lantern show. The entire courthouse watched in horrified silence as scenes of slavery's brutality played out before them, not just Elizabeth's experiences but those of countless others, a catalogue of horror that went on for what felt like hours but was recorded as lasting only minutes. When the visions ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the courthouse. Even Ashley's lawyers were weeping, and Colonel Ashley himself had fallen to his knees, his face white as paper, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The jury didn't even leave to deliberate. They declared Elizabeth free on the spot, and this time the judge ordered that the decision was final and could not be appealed within Massachusetts. But the spirits weren't satisfied with legal freedom alone. They wanted revenge, and Elizabeth, bound to them by the pact she had made, was their instrument. The third lawsuit, which she filed immediately after winning the second, wasn't about her freedom but about damages. She was suing the Ashley family for 40 years of unpaid wages, for the assault with the shovel, and for what she called spiritual damages, a legal concept that didn't exist but that no lawyer seemed able to argue against. By the time of the third trial, the Ashley family was in complete disarray. Hannah Ashley had been committed to an asylum after being found trying to claw her own eyes out, screaming that she couldn't stand to see the faces anymore. 2 of Ashley's children had fled Massachusetts entirely, claiming that the family was cursed. Colonel Ashley himself had aged 20 years in 6 months, his hair white, his hands palsied, his once commanding presence reduced to that of a frightened old man who jumped at shadows. The third trial was held in October 1781, on a date when locals reported that the veil between worlds was thinnest. The courthouse was surrounded by a fog that seemed to move against the wind, and several people swore they saw figures in that fog, translucent forms in chains that disappeared when looked at directly. Inside the courthouse the air was so cold that ice formed on the walls, despite logs burning in every fireplace. Elizabeth entered the courthouse that day transformed. Gone was any pretense of being merely a woman seeking justice. She moved like something otherworldly, her feet not quite touching the ground, her shadow stretching in impossible directions. When she spoke, her voice was layered, as if dozens of people were speaking in unison through her mouth, "This is not just my lawsuit," she declared to the packed courthouse. "This is a reckoning for every drop of blood shed in bondage, for every family torn apart, for every life destroyed by the evil of slavery. The Ashley family will pay not just in money but in understanding. They will know, truly know what they have done." What happened next was described differently by every witness, as if each person saw something unique to their own fears and guilt. Some claimed that the dead rose from beneath the courthouse floor, skeletal hands reaching up through the boards to point accusing fingers at Ashley. Others said the walls became transparent, revealing torture chambers and mass graves that had never been documented. Still others reported that time itself seemed to fracture, showing past, present, and future simultaneously, revealing that the consequences of slavery would echo through generations yet unborn. Colonel Ashley, faced with this supernatural trial, broke completely. He confessed to crimes that went far beyond what was publicly known, speaking about murdered enslaved people buried in unmarked graves, about children sold away from mothers who were told they had died of fever, about a systematic campaign of terror designed to break the spirits of those he owned. He offered Elizabeth not just the damages she sought, but his entire fortune, begging her to call off the spirits that tormented him day and night. Elizabeth accepted his offer, but the spirits' hunger wasn't so easily satisfied. They had been feeding on suffering for so long that they had developed a taste for it, and they weren't willing to give up their claim on the Ashley family so easily. The curse they had woven into Elizabeth's lawsuits would follow the Ashley bloodline for generations. Every descendant would be haunted by visions of the enslaved people their ancestors had tortured. They would hear the rattling of chains in their dreams, feel the weight of shackles on their wrists, experience randomly and without warning the sensation of being property rather than people. Theodore Sedgwick, who had represented Elizabeth through all three trials, would later write in his secret journal that winning her freedom had been both the greatest achievement and the most terrifying experience of his legal career. He described Elizabeth as a force of nature wrapped in human form, someone who had channeled the rage and pain of countless victims into a weapon that the legal system couldn't defend against. He also noted that after the trials, he could never again argue that slavery was merely a political or economic issue. He had seen its spiritual consequences, the way it corrupted not just individuals but reality itself. Elizabeth Freeman, now legally free and wealthy from the damages awarded by the court, should have been able to live out her days in peace. But the pact she had made with the spirits wasn't so easily concluded. They had given her the power to win her freedom and destroy her oppressors, but they demanded continued service. She became a conduit for their justice, a living curse upon those who profited from slavery. She purchased a small house on the outskirts of Stockbridge, but it quickly became known as a place where strange things happened. Other formerly enslaved people would visit her seeking help with their own freedom suits, and she would assist them, but always at a price. Not money, but a promise to carry forward the spirit's mission of vengeance against those who had built their fortunes on human bondage. Each person she helped became part of an ever-growing network of individuals touched by the supernatural forces she had unleashed. The house itself became a nexus of paranormal activity. Neighbours reported seeing lights in the windows at all hours of the night, even when Elizabeth was known to be elsewhere. Strange symbols would appear on the trees surrounding her property, symbols that hurt to look at, and that seemed to move when observed peripherally. Animals avoided the area entirely, and even the bravest children wouldn't dare approach her door after dark. But it was what happened to the Ashley family that truly demonstrated the power of the curse Elizabeth had brought down upon them. Within a year of the third trial, Colonel John Ashley was dead, found in his study with his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his hair completely white, his fingers worn bloody from clawing at something only he could see. The autopsy, performed by a doctor who would quit medicine immediately afterward, revealed that his heart had literally exploded from fear. Hannah Ashley died in the asylum, but not from madness. The attendants found her one morning turned completely to stone, a perfect statue capturing a moment of unbearable horror. The statue was supposedly destroyed, but rumours persisted for decades that it had been seen in various locations throughout Massachusetts, always positioned as if trying to escape from something, always with that same expression of terminal fear. The Ashley children fared no better. The eldest son, John Jr., inherited what remained of the family fortune but could never enjoy it. He reported that money would turn to blood in his hands, that food would become ash in his mouth, that every comfort he tried to purchase would transform into an instrument of torture. He eventually gave away everything and became a hermit, living in a cave in the Berkshire Mountains, where hikers would sometimes hear him screaming apologies to people who weren't there. The daughter, Sarah Ashley, tried to escape by marrying and taking her husband's name, but the curse followed bloodlines, not surnames. Her children were born with memories that weren't their own, memories of being enslaved, of being whipped, of being sold. They would wake screaming in languages they didn't speak, bearing wounds that would appear spontaneously on their bodies, wounds that matched those inflicted on enslaved people decades earlier. Even distant relatives of the Ashley family found themselves affected. A cousin in Boston reported that his house had become infested with chains that would appear overnight, filling rooms so completely that they couldn't be entered. Another relative in Connecticut claimed that he could hear the voices of enslaved people singing work songs, but the songs were coming from inside his own throat, forcing him to sing of sufferings he had never experienced but somehow remembered. Elizabeth Freeman lived for another 48 years after winning her freedom, dying in 1829 at the age of approximately 85. But those who knew her in those final decades said she had changed fundamentally from the woman who had first sued for freedom. She rarely slept, claiming that when she closed her eyes she was transported to a realm where the spirits of the enslaved held court, demanding justice for crimes that the living world refused to fully acknowledge. She became a living repository of stories that had never been recorded, able to recite the names and histories of enslaved people from across Massachusetts and beyond. When asked how she knew these things, she would simply say that the dead had long memories and were eager to share them with anyone who would listen. She would sit on her porch in the evenings, seemingly talking to herself, but neighbors swore they could sometimes see translucent figures sitting with her, figures in chains who would nod along as she spoke. The freedom suits that followed Elizabeth's victory often bore the mark of her influence. Lawyers reported that their enslaved clients would sometimes speak with knowledge of legal precedents they couldn't possibly have learned, using arguments that seemed to come from some supernatural source. These cases had an unusually high success rate, and many noted that the opposition lawyers would often become violently ill during proceedings, claiming they felt invisible hands around their throats whenever they tried to argue in favor of slavery. As Elizabeth aged, her supernatural abilities seemed to grow stronger rather than weaker. She could allegedly appear in multiple places at once, being seen simultaneously at freedom trials in different counties. Witnesses described her as sometimes appearing decades younger during these appearances, as if time itself bent around her presence. Others claimed that when she touched them, they could feel the memories of dozens of other people flooding into their minds, experiencing lives and deaths that weren't their own. The most disturbing incidents involved those who tried to harm her or other formerly enslaved people. A group of men who attempted to kidnap her in 1790, intending to sell her back into slavery in the South, were found days later wandering the woods, their minds completely gone, able only to repeat the names of enslaved people they had never met. Their leader was discovered hanging from a tree, but the rope was made of something that looked like human hair, and his body bore whip marks that appeared to have come from inside his skin, pushing outward. Another incident in 1805 involved a lawyer who had made his fortune defending slaveholders and who publicly challenged Elizabeth's freedom in court, claiming her original trials had been fraudulent. That night, everyone in his boarding house reported hearing screams from his room, but when they broke down the door they found him alone, his body covered in brands spelling out the names of plantations, his mouth filled with cotton that seemed to be growing from his tongue. He survived but never spoke again, spending his remaining years writing the same phrase over and over, "I see them all." Elizabeth's influence extended beyond individual cases to affect the broader cultural understanding of slavery in Massachusetts. Churches where she attended services reported that during her presence, the walls would sometimes bleed and voices would speak from the air, reciting passages from the Bible that condemned oppression. Several ministers claimed that their sermons would change without their control when she was present, their mouths speaking truths about slavery that they had never intended to voice. The records of her activities during this period are fragmented, partly because many witnesses were too frightened to document what they saw, and partly because documents relating to her had a tendency to spontaneously combust or become illegible. Court records would be found with pages fused together by what appeared to be blood, or with text that would rearrange itself when read, changing from legal language to accusations of murder and torture. Theodore Sedgwick, who remained in contact with Elizabeth until his death in 1813, left behind the most complete account of her later years. His private journals, discovered in that locked chest beneath the courthouse floorboards in 1972, painted a picture of a woman who had become something more and less than human. He described visiting her house and finding rooms that shouldn't exist, doors that opened onto plantations in the deep south where enslaved people were still working, windows that showed the past and future simultaneously. In one particularly disturbing entry, dated 1809, Sedgwick wrote about watching Elizabeth conduct what she called a trial of the dead. In her parlour, she had somehow summoned the spirits of deceased slaveholders and the ghosts of their victims. The enslaved spirits presented evidence of their suffering while the slaveholders' ghosts tried to defend themselves, but their words would turn to screams as they were forced to experience every cruelty they had inflicted. Sedgwick claimed that these trials went on every night, and that Elizabeth served as both judge and executioner, condemning the guilty to relive their victims' suffering for eternity. But the most significant revelation in Sedgwick's journals concerned Elizabeth's true nature. He theorized that the woman who had won her freedom in 1781 had actually died during that first trial, that the trauma and the pact with the spirits had killed her human self. What continued to walk and talk and age was something else, a vessel for the collective rage and pain of thousands of enslaved souls. She was no longer Elizabeth Freeman, but had become all of them, every person who had died in chains, using her body to interact with a world that had denied them justice in life. This theory was supported by incidents in Elizabeth's final years. Witnesses reported that her appearance would sometimes shift, that they would look at her and see different faces overlapping, all of them bearing the marks of slavery. Her voice would layer and multiply, speaking in tongues that predated European colonization. Objects around her would age rapidly or revert to earlier states, as if time itself was unstable in her presence. The strangest incident occurred in 1827, 2 years before her official death. A group of abolitionists visited her, seeking her blessing for their work. They reported that when she touched each of them, they experienced visions of the future, seeing a great war that would tear the nation apart, fields running red with blood and cities burning. But they also saw beyond that, to a time when the descendants of enslaved people would walk free, though still fighting for true equality. One of these abolitionists, whose name was carefully redacted from all records, claimed that Elizabeth told him the exact date the war would begin and end, and that she named specific battles before they happened. When Elizabeth Freeman finally died on December 28, 1829, her passing was anything but peaceful. Witnesses reported that her house shook as if in an earthquake, that the windows exploded outward, and that a sound like thousands of voices screaming erupted from the building. The undertaker who prepared her body quit his profession immediately afterward, refusing to say what he had seen, though his wife later told neighbours that he would wake up crying about chains growing from flesh and eyes that wouldn't stay closed. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, both black and white, but the ceremony was disrupted by supernatural events. The coffin allegedly levitated several times, and mourners reported hearing voices coming from inside it, multiple voices speaking simultaneously. When they tried to lower the coffin into the ground, the earth itself seemed to reject it, pushing it back up 3 times before finally accepting it. Even then, the grave had to be redug multiple times over the following weeks, as it would mysteriously empty itself overnight. The graveyard where Elizabeth was buried became a site of pilgrimage for formerly enslaved people seeking justice, but also a place of terror for the descendants of slaveholders. Many reported experiencing visions of their ancestors' crimes when passing by her grave. Some claimed to see Elizabeth herself standing beside her headstone, but when they looked closer they would realize they were seeing dozens of figures occupying the same space, all of them watching, with eyes that burned with an otherworldly fire. The most disturbing discovery came in 1923, when the old Sheffield courthouse was being demolished. Workers found a hidden room beneath the building, directly under where the trials had taken place. The room was filled with artifacts that shouldn't have existed, chains that bled when touched, documents written in languages that no scholar could identify, and most disturbingly, what appeared to be a chronicle of every enslaved person who had ever lived in Massachusetts, their names, their stories, their deaths, all written in what analysis would later confirm was Elizabeth Freeman's handwriting, despite many of the entries being dated after her death. But the most terrifying discovery was a series of paintings on the walls, apparently drawn in a mixture of blood and some unidentifiable substance. They showed scenes of a great reckoning, a time when the spirits of the enslaved would rise to judge not just their direct oppressors, but all who had benefited from the system of slavery. The painting seemed to move when viewed peripherally, and several workers reported that they could hear screams coming from the images. The room also contained what appeared to be a contract, written on what forensic analysis would later suggest was human skin. The contract was between Elizabeth Freeman and entities whose names were written in symbols that hurt to look at directly. The terms were mostly illegible, but what could be read suggested that Elizabeth's freedom had been purchased not just with her own service to these entities, but with a promise that the curse on those who profited from slavery would continue through generations, growing stronger with each passing year. Theodore Sedgwick's journal, found in the same hidden room, contained his final entry, dated shortly before his death. In it, he confessed that he had helped Elizabeth not out of moral conviction alone, but because she had shown him what would happen to his family if he refused. He had seen visions of his descendants tormented by the same spirits that plagued the Ashley family, unless he aided in her cause. He ended the entry with a warning that Elizabeth Freeman's story was far from over, that what she'd become would continue to influence events long after her body had turned to dust. Indeed, the legacy of Elizabeth Freeman's supernatural trial continued well into the 20th and 21st centuries. Descendants of the Ashley family reported ongoing hauntings, inexplicable illnesses, and a family tendency toward madness that psychiatric treatment couldn't cure. Many changed their names and moved far from Massachusetts, but the curse followed bloodlines, not geography. Support groups were quietly formed for what members called ancestral guilt syndrome, though they were careful never to publicly connect their suffering to the events of 1781. Meanwhile, civil rights lawyers throughout American history have reported strange assistances during crucial cases. During Brown v. Board of Education, Thurgood Marshall privately wrote about feeling a presence in the courtroom, hearing whispered arguments in his ear that proved devastatingly effective. During the Montgomery bus boycott, Rosa Parks claimed that when she refused to give up her seat, she felt the strength of thousands of women who had come before her, and for just a moment thought she saw a tall, scarred black woman nodding at her from the back of the bus. Even today, in courtrooms across America where cases of discrimination and injustice are tried, lawyers and witnesses report unexplainable phenomena. voices speaking from empty air, documents changing to reveal hidden evidence, and opposing counsel becoming mysteriously ill when defending oppression. Some have reported seeing a woman matching Elizabeth Freeman's description in the gallery, though she appears different to each observer, sometimes young, sometimes old, sometimes not quite human at all. The house where Elizabeth lived in Stockbridge still stands, though it has been abandoned for decades. The city has tried to demolish it multiple times, but workers report that their equipment malfunctions when they approach, that they hear voices warning them away, that they see things in the windows that shouldn't exist. Paranormal investigators who have attempted to study the house have either fled in terror or emerged changed, speaking about things they refuse to describe in detail, mentioning only that the past isn't past, and that justice delayed is not justice denied, but justice transformed into something far more terrible. Local legends speak of people who have entered the house and emerge with knowledge they shouldn't possess, understanding of historical events from the perspective of the enslaved, memories of lives they never lived. Some have used this knowledge to become powerful advocates for justice, while others have been driven mad by the weight of experiencing centuries of suffering in a single moment. The cemetery where Elizabeth is buried remains active as well. Groundskeepers report that her grave never needs maintenance, that flowers appear on it without anyone planting them, flowers that botanical experts can't identify, and that seem to whisper when the wind passes through them. On certain nights, particularly on the anniversaries of her trials, witnesses report seeing gatherings at her grave, translucent figures in chains who seem to be celebrating and mourning simultaneously. But perhaps the most disturbing ongoing phenomenon involves the bloodlines of those who profited from slavery. Genealogists have noted statistical anomalies in these family lines, unusually high rates of mysterious deaths, mental illness, and what can only be described as generational curses. Children born into these families sometimes speak their first words in languages their parents don't recognize, languages that linguistic experts identify as West African dialects that haven't been spoken for centuries. The legal documents from Elizabeth's trials, those that survived the supernatural events surrounding them, are kept in a special vault in the Massachusetts State Archives. Archivists report that these documents must be stored separately from others because they affect nearby papers, causing them to develop mysterious stains that look like blood or text that changes when no one is looking. Several researchers who have studied these documents extensively have reported experiencing visions of the trials, not as they were recorded but as they truly happened, with all the supernatural events that official records tried to omit. Modern descendants of Elizabeth Freeman, those who can trace their lineage to her sister Lizzie, who also won her freedom, report that they sometimes dream of her. In these dreams she appears not as an elderly woman, but as something between human and spirit, surrounded by thousands of ghostly figures. She tells them that the work isn't finished, that justice is patient but persistent, that every generation must continue the fight she began, not just in the courts, but in the spiritual realm where the true battle for human dignity continues. Some historians have tried to rationalize Elizabeth Freeman's story, to strip away the supernatural elements and present her simply as a brave woman who used the legal system to win her freedom. But those who have dug deepest into the primary sources, who have read the unedited testimonies and seen the evidence that was hidden away, know that her story cannot be separated from the supernatural forces she allied herself with. She didn't just sue for her freedom, she unleashed something that fundamentally changed the spiritual landscape of America, ensuring that the crime of slavery would never be forgotten or forgiven. The truth that those sealed documents reveal is that Elizabeth Freeman's 3 lawsuits were not just legal proceedings, but rituals, each one binding the American legal system to acknowledge truths it had tried to deny. The first lawsuit established that the enslaved were human beings with rights. The second confirmed that those rights could not be violated without consequence. The third ensured that the consequences would echo through generations, a curse on all who profited from human bondage that would last until true justice was achieved. What the authorities who sealed these records understood, what they tried to hide, was that Elizabeth Freeman had done more than win her freedom. She had torn a hole in reality itself, creating a permanent connection between the world of the living and the realm where the victims of slavery waited for justice. Through that hole, the voices of millions who died in chains continue to speak, their words carried on the wind, their presence felt in courtrooms and capitals, their demand for recognition and reparation growing stronger with each passing year. This is why certain powerful families still pay to keep the records sealed, why they fund efforts to present sanitized versions of Elizabeth's story that focus only on her legal victory. They know that if the full truth were widely known, if people understood that the curse she brought down on the beneficiaries of slavery is still active, still growing, still seeking new vessels through which to work, it would fundamentally change how Americans understand their history and their present. But the spirits that Elizabeth Freeman allied with don't need official recognition to continue their work. Every time a descendant of enslaved people stands up for justice, they carry a piece of Elizabeth's power with them. Every time someone fights against oppression, they channel the same forces she unleashed. The supernatural trial that began in 1781 has never really ended. It continues in every struggle for human dignity, with Elizabeth Freeman's spirit and the thousands of souls bound to her serving as eternal prosecutors in the case against injustice. Some nights, if you know where to look, you can still see evidence of the ongoing trial. In courthouses across America, security cameras capture shadows moving when buildings are empty. Figures in chains walking through walls, voices speaking words that the microphones can't quite pick up. In the old plantation houses of the South, now converted to museums, tourists report feeling sudden cold spots, hearing whispers in languages they don't recognize, seeing faces in mirrors that aren't their own. The Ashley family descendants, those few who remain and will speak about their curse, describe an existence haunted by knowledge they wish they didn't have. They see the world through dual vision, simultaneously experiencing their comfortable modern lives and the horrific reality their ancestors created. They wake up with whip marks on their backs that fade by morning, taste blood in their food that others can't detect, hear the constant rattling of chains that no one else perceives. Some have tried to make amends, dedicating their lives and fortunes to civil rights causes, but the curse remains, a reminder that some crimes cannot be absolved through good intentions alone. The research into Elizabeth Freeman's story has claimed several academic careers. Professors who delve too deeply into the primary sources report experiencing what they call temporal displacement, moments where they find themselves seemingly transported to 1781, watching the trials unfold, feeling the supernatural forces at work. Some have emerged from archives with knowledge of historical events that were never recorded, details about enslaved people's lives that no document contains. Others have simply disappeared, leaving behind research notes that trail off mid-sentence, the final words often being Elizabeth Freeman sees all. What makes Elizabeth Freeman's story truly terrifying is not just what happened in the past, but what it suggests about the present and future. If her curse is real, if the spirits of the enslaved are still seeking justice, then America's reckoning with its history of slavery is far from over. The supernatural forces she unleashed are patient, methodical, and inevitable. They work through generations, through bloodlines, through the very fabric of legal and social systems built on the profits of human bondage. This is the story they didn't want you to know, the one they buried in courthouse basements and locked away in archives. Elizabeth Freeman didn't just sue for her freedom 3 times and win. She opened a door that can never be closed, made a pact that binds America to face its original sin not just in history books and museums, but in the spiritual realm where true justice resides. Every American who benefits from systems built on slavery, which is to say nearly everyone, carries a piece of this curse, a debt that grows with compound interest, waiting for the day when full payment will be demanded. Those who research Elizabeth Freeman's true story often report the same phenomenon. As they dig deeper into the archives, as they piece together the testimonies and evidence, they begin to feel watched. They see movement in their peripheral vision, shadows that shouldn't be there, figures that disappear when looked at directly. They hear whispers in empty rooms, voices speaking names they don't recognize but somehow know are important. Some report finding documents in their research that they didn't remember pulling, papers that contain information they were searching for but that officially don't exist. The truth is that Elizabeth Freeman's story is still being written. Every act of racism, every instance of injustice, adds another chapter to the supernatural trial she began. Every victory for civil rights, every step toward true equality, brings the final verdict closer. The spirits she allied with are keeping score, recording every crime and every act of redemption, building a case that will one day be presented before a court that no human lawyer can argue before and no human judge can overrule. This is what the sealed records reveal, what the hidden documents confirm, what the testimony of hundreds of witnesses across nearly 2.5 centuries attests to. Elizabeth Freeman was more than a woman who won her freedom. She was a conduit for forces that transformed the very nature of justice from a human concept into a cosmic certainty. Her 3 trials were just the beginning of a much larger proceeding, one that continues every day in seen and unseen ways, one that will not conclude until the debt of slavery is paid in full. So the next time you hear about Elizabeth Freeman in a history class, remember that you're hearing the sanitized version, the one designed to make her story palatable, safe, concluded. The real story, the one written in blood and spirit and cosmic justice, is still unfolding. The real Elizabeth Freeman is still out there, still fighting, still winning cases in courts that exist between worlds, and the spirits of millions who died in bondage stand with her, their voices growing louder with each passing year, their demand for justice becoming impossible to ignore. The winter of 1781 in Sheffield, Massachusetts, didn't just bring snow to the Ashley household, it brought the beginning of a reckoning that continues to this day. Elizabeth Freeman's legal victory was just the visible part of something much larger, much older, and much more powerful than any human court could contain. She didn't just sue for freedom, she summoned justice itself, and justice, once awakened, never sleeps. If you've made it through this entire story, you're one of the few brave enough to confront the real history hiding beneath America's polished narrative. Share this video with someone who needs to know the truth. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell to join our community of truth seekers. Comment below with your thoughts. Have you or your family experienced anything that might be connected to Elizabeth Freeman's curse? What state are you watching from? And remember, the past isn't really past. It lives on in ways we're only beginning to understand, waiting for those brave enough to uncover its secrets. Elizabeth Freeman's story reminds us that justice may be delayed, but it can never be denied. It just takes forms we never expected, working through channels we can't always see, ensuring that every wrong will eventually be made right, no matter how long it takes or what forces must be unleashed to achieve it. The real question is not whether the curse is real, but whether America is ready to face the full weight of its history and the supernatural reckoning that Elizabeth Freeman set in motion on that cold winter day in 1781.